I'm sure you will all become Menachem fans by the end. I'm a huge fan of his. And okay. I think these classes, they're short, so it gives you a taste. And if you're interested in learning more, you can always, the internet has tons of stuff, tons of books. I know I now want to learn so much more. So let me share with you what I know. In 1977, Menachem Begin was elected Israel's 6th prime minister. And soon after he was elected, one of the things he did was he went to the Kotel because he wanted to thank God for winning. And he wasn't a religious person, but he was very traditional and he knew the Tanakh. He keep a Tanakh with him a lot. And later on, we're going to talk about that he was jailed, and he actually brought a Tanakh with him to jail. He was jailed by the Russian authorities. And there's a picture, not this one, I couldn't find it, but if I come across it, I will share it. Right after Begin visited the Kotel, so he's walking back, he's in the plaza, and this lady with the mitpachat on her head, with the scarf on her head, an old lady and like some plants, she comes up to him, and he has 3 security agents and there's policemen around him, and they push her away. It's actually a very similar story in the Tanakh, like this with Elisha Hanavi, for those of you that are familiar with the story. And he says, why are you pushing her away? And he looks at the woman and he kisses her hand, and she blesses him and she gives him the plants or flowers, whatever she was carrying. It wasn't originally for him because she didn't know she would meet him that day, but she gives it to him and he takes it and says, thank you. And they bless each other and he continues on his way. Now, this story is very reflective of who Menachem Begin was and some of the values that he had. She's some random lady from the shuk, and he gives her respect, and if she was the Queen of England, he would have given her the same respect, because that was one of his core values, to respect humankind, all humans, Jewish, non-Jewish. They said that when he became prime minister, and it's interesting, a lot of what I'm going to tell you today, it happened before he was even prime minister. So imagine if he accomplished so much before when he's actually prime minister, what he does. So when he was prime minister and he had to get to his office, they said it would take him a half hour to get to his office because he would talk to the guard and then he would talk to someone at the desk. And as opposed to other prime ministers where they say it would take him 3 minutes, they walk in at the desk. And he would also receive a lot of letters, and he would answer every letter by himself. He would open it and read it and write back, because he said a person is writing me the letter and not answering letters like someone holding your hand to shake your hand and you not taking it. So that was something about Menachem Begin. And what we are going to discuss today are what were some of his core values, how were his values put to the test, and that's where you really see, does a person believe in what they say they believe in when they're being tested? What were some lasting impacts of his leadership? And of course, a new place to visit in Israel. Okay. And the higher question is how, and this is what made me think to speak about Begin, is how can living by some of his values help the government and the people of Israel? And I think for current prime ministers or anyone in an elected office to know who the prime ministers were that came before you, not only what they did for the country, but in terms of what they believed in, is really valuable. So the story we opened with illustrated illustrated his respect for humankind. And I want you to keep this in mind as we continue learning a little bit about his life. So Begin was born in 1913 in Brisk, which belongs to the Russian Empire. His dad was a secretary for the Jewish community, didn't make a lot of money, but none of the Jews there really had a lot of money. And something that Begin says, but growing up at home, the conversations were always about 2 things. They were about the future of the Jewish people and the future of the Jewish state, which wasn't yet the state of Israel in 1913. And when I reflect upon this sentence, that this is what he said they spoke about at home, and then he becomes the prime minister of Israel, I think about how powerful it is and how much we need to be aware of what we speak about at home. And I think about what I grew up with at home, and God willing, when I have children and a family, what I want the conversation to be. Is it going to be at Israel? Is it going to be about values? Is it going to be complaining about how expensive things are? Is it whatever it is that really frames a person's thinking? And he said, this is what we spoke about all the time, the Jewish people and the Jewish state. So that was one of the things that was formative in his life. When he was 13 on Lag BaOmer, he stood up on a table and he gave his first speech. The people asked him to speak, and he spoke about Bar Kochva and the leader that he was, and connected it to Lag BaOmer. And that was the start of his very talented career as a speaker. I opened the class saying that part of what gave me the idea to speak about Menachem Begin is I keep seeing on Facebook all these clips and quotes of him. There's all these famous quotes from Begin. He was an amazing speaker. He'd speak and people were electrified. And it really started from a young age. Something else that he did at a young age, there is this concept in Israel of youth movements. Some of the familiar ones maybe to people are something called Bnei Akiva. And what these youth movements do is they're movements that have these ideas and very strong values, and they try to teach it to the kids. And in Israel, almost every kid, modern Orthodox, is connected to a youth movement, and they have activities. And then every year, when the kids grow older, then they become the counselors. Growing up, I didn't have anything like it. No youth movements that exist in my community. I just think it's such a wonderful thing because one, it empowers the kids who are teenagers to teach over the values. And when you hear this day after day, week after week, year after year, it really has a lasting impact. And why not add it as a fun thing to whatever else is going on in your life? So there was this movement known as Beitar, which was started by a man named Jabotinsky. Now, Jabotinsky, he was a big proponent and fighter for the Jewish people, for Israel. He said, we want the whole land of Israel. And in the next slide, we're going to talk about some of his ideas. And he came one day to speak, and Begin heard him. He was a teenager when he heard him. And they asked, what was your reaction after you heard him? Did you think he was great? Were you entranced by what he said? And he said, after I heard Jabotinsky speak, hitkadashti. I was elevated, I was raised up, I was made more holy. It started this huge admiration that Begin had for Jabotinsky for the rest of his life. I want to share what was some of the ideas of this movement that impacted Begin and that he continued forward in whatever else he did. So one core value of this Beitar youth movement was founding a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan. And there's a quote, Shte gadot layarden, and there's two banks to the Jordan, zo shelanu, zo gam ken. This is ours and this is ours too. And one of his strong beliefs was the whole Jewish state belongs to us. And that is extremely significant, especially if you're going to become Prime Minister of Israel, because always the questions that come up is giving back land. Do we give back Yehuda Shamaron? Do we not? Do we give back Gaza when it was ours? Do we not? Sinai, Golan, what do we do? It's always something that's on the table. Even though Israel won in a war, and usually when you win land in a war, it belongs to you. For Israel, it's always on the table as a question. So Begin believes it's ours. And the second core belief of the Beitar movement was to commit to help defend your nation, defend only. And on this point, Begin disagreed with Jabotinsky, and he got up on the podium and he spoke, and he said, defense is not enough. We need to attack as well. And this is something that we'll see in Begin's life he really believed in and acted upon. When Begin was 26, he traveled a lot because he was the head of one of the branches of the Beitar movement. Jabotinsky gave him a job to be in charge, especially after this. They say Jabotinsky afterwards, he's going home and he's speaking to a guy, and he tells the guy, one day this guy over here is going to be the leader. So Begin, he's at a man's house for dinner, and he sees these two twin girls by the table, and he tells himself, one of these women is going to be my wife. And the next day he writes a note to one of them, who was named Elisa, and he writes, I saw you last night for the first time in my life, but I feel like I know you forever. And he courts her and he wants her to be his wife. And he tells her, I'm warning you, being married to me is not going to be easy, because I am going to be involved in politics, and anyone in a political life, you're always in the public eye, and people love you, people hate you, it's a hard life. And he also said it's not a rich life, because they didn't make a lot of money, which is interesting now if you think of politicians, and a lot of them make nice salaries, but back then, you're in politics, you're not going to be doing well. And she wanted to marry him. Here's a picture of them when they're younger. Here's a picture of them later. And Elisa Begin stood by her husband's side for his entire life. Later on, soon, I'm going to talk about how he was in prison. And he was supposed to be in prison for 8 years. And it was known that most people that go there don't come out. And he didn't know what would happen to him. And he told his wife, I want to give you a get. I want to divorce you, because who knows what's going to happen to you. If I die, who even is going to be there to know and say, oh, you died? So let me divorce you, please, so you could go marry someone else. And she refused. She was a woman of kindness. She would help kids in need, women in need, and she always stuck by him and with him. Later, when he died 10 years before her, and he was heartbroken from that. So this is Eliza Begin and Menachem Begin. Now we're going to talk about jail. In 1940, Menachem Begin was put in jail. Why? The Russians accused him of Zionist activity. You are supporting the state of Israel. You're doing all these activities, not on our watch. They put him in prison. Like I said, he was supposed to be there for 8 years. Luckily for him, he was only there for 8 months, and then he was released as part of an agreement between countries. He was released to join the Polish army because he was Polish. And Begin, he writes about his days in the prison, and he said that it was the hardest time in his life, terrible experience, and it impacted him forever. And some of the things we did in his life were affected by the fact that he was in prison. One of them being that when Israel captured terrorists in his time, he said, if you want to get information from them, get it, but get it with your mind. Do not torture them physically. And this was directly impacted by him being in prison, backbreaking labor, starving, cold, forests with bears all around. And this had it's I think really remarkable that when someone goes through something like this, it's definitely a formative event. And he didn't come out broken from it. He came out stronger and used it to help him out later on in life. And any experience that we have, 1 second, I keep hearing WhatsApp on my computer. I want to just close it because I don't like the ding. Okay, and then I'm going to reshare. Great. Okay, so Begin, he's now part of the Polish army, and he gets to Israel. Now, a lot of Jews that joined the Polish army, they left because they don't want to be in the Polish army. However, Begin refused to leave because he said, I'm a man of my word. If I'm in the army now, I'm going to be a good soldier. I'm not just going to leave. The Irgun, which was an underground fighting organization in Israel, they wanted Begin to be the head of their movement. They're fighting. Their head was killed in Iraq. And they said they want him to be the new head because they really identify with his values. And he says, but I don't know about fighting. How could I help you? They said, oh, we don't need you to be the head of the fighting. We have other people for that. But what we do need you for is you have a way of convincing people of ideas. And we want you because of your ideas, because of your mind. Please join us. And the Irgun, they organized the way for him to get out of the Polish army, which was only supposed to be for a year, but ended up being forever. And he joins the Irgun. Now, to add a little bit of Israeli history to understand this more, today we have Tzahal, Tzava Hagana Israel. But before we had Tzahal, we had all different organizations, fighting groups. First, we had the Hagana. And then what happened is there were people in the Hagana, and hearing the name Hagana as defense, that said, you guys need to be more proactive. So they broke off and they formed the Irgun, which was more proactive in fighting. And then there were people that broke off from that, said, you're not doing enough, and they formed the Leche. So these were all different underground fighting groups, which eventually merged together and became Tzahal. So Menachem Begin is the head of the Irgun. And the idea that all the youth movements had then is this concept, we want to form a Yehudi Chadash, a new Jew. What should the new Jew look like? And in Begin's idea, the new Jew should be one that stands up for himself and fights back. And you see in this picture, the old Jew is just sitting down, scared, and the new Jew who's standing up and fighting and proud for who he is. And something else Begin was quoted to have said is that he believed everyone is Bnei Menachem, the sons of kings, and he believed in life for everyone. Now notice he's saying sons of kings, not we believe everyone is human. To be a son of a king is a pretty high state. And he said everyone should have a high standard and they should treat themselves in a certain way with self-respect, and they should treat others with self-respect. And he strove high for what he believed for humanity. And one of his things as prime minister that I'll just throw in there is he helped renovate a lot of buildings because he didn't want people to live poor. And he said, I would love if when I'm done my term as prime minister, there's no poverty in Israel. So that was something that was really important to him. In 1944, the Irgun is rebelling against the British rule. In the beginning, people were happy with the British. They were really welcomed them after the Ottoman Empire. And then as time went on, things got worse, especially because there's always the conflicts between the Arabs and the Jews, and the British oftentimes sided with the Arabs, even though we're supposed to be neutral. And the Irgun is fighting against the British. They want the British out. And Menachem Begin says this straight out: we would like the British removal from this land. And he tells the Arabs, our war is not with you, it's with the British. And one of his jobs as the head of the Irgun was to come out with statements like this. As all this is going on, so is World War II, which puts the state of Israel, which isn't yet a state, but the people of Israel and whoever is governing them in a huge problem. Because Britain was fighting the Germans, which is great. We want them to fight Nazi Germany. But they were also making life very hard for the Jews living in Israel. They were limiting the amount of people that could make Aliyah at a time when the Jews are desperate for refuge, desperate to come to Israel. The British is limiting it. So what do? Do you fight against the British? We're fighting the Nazis, which is great. Or do you not? So people were really divided on this topic. And what Menachem Begin, as the head of the Irgun, decided, he said, even though we are appreciative of the British for fighting the Nazis, we don't like what the British are doing here in Israel. We are going to fight them. This is what he decided, and this is what the Irgun did. They continued fighting against the British. However, this was not good with everyone. The Haganah was not happy with this approach. They said we should not be fighting the British at a time when the British is helping us against the Germans, even though they're not so great to us here. And then what began was a period in history known as the saison. Saison in French means hunting season. And the Haganah, what they then did is they engaged in intense efforts to take Irgun members, hand them over to the British. As far as the British were concerned, the Irgun are a terrorist organization. So, and the Haganah helped. Let's capture the Irgun members. Let's interrogate them. Let's stop their activity. And the activity of the Irgun really, really declined because everyone was against them. If we take a minute to pause, it was really heartbreaking and terrible because they're all Jewish people. They should be united. And instead of being united, because the Irgun members refused to cease activity, the Haganah is going against them. And this was this period of time, which lasted about a year. And what was Begin's response? And I think in his response, we see his greatness. And this response we're going to be seeing another time and throughout his entire leadership. And he's the head of the Irgun. He says, a civil war is the most dangerous thing that can happen. A Jew should not fight a Jew. He believes this every fiber of his being. So the Jews are in a very delicate situation. Internal fighting will hold us back from what we want to achieve. And because he believed this, he told his Irgun soldiers, run away rather than lift a hand against a brother. Do not shoot back. Don't. Now, some basics of self-defense. Someone is shooting you, you shoot back. But he said, we're not shooting Jews back. We're just not doing that. And this picture over here is very hard to recognize, but this is actually Menachem Begin. Why does he look like a rabbi? This is his wife, Eliza, and this is their son, Benny. Because this is actually one of the disguises of Begin. Everyone was searching for him. As the head of the Irgun, he was wanted. So he posed as Rabbi Israel Sassober, and until he could come out, and the Irgun looked for him. Not the Irgun, he's the head of the Irgun, but the Haganah and the British all searching for him. Nobody could find him. So this is a fun fact about Begin. In 1945, the season ends, and they decide we're not going to keep going after the Irgun members, and instead, all the organizations unite: the Haganah, the Lechi, the Irgun, and they have a movement called the Jewish Resistance Movement, and there's activities that they do together against the British. They decide we want to unite against the British. Now, ask yourself, why does this have to happen now? Why can't they have done it before? Why they waste all their time go against their brother only to join together? I don't know, but at least they did eventually join together. May 14th, 1948, Ben Gurion declares the state of Israel. Now, him and Begin, they were not friends. Begin says he wasn't my enemy, he was my yeriv in Hebrew, foe, I guess you would call it in English. And they don't see eye to eye on many, many issues. But Ben Gurion knows the power that Begin has, and right before the state of Israel was declared, so I also gave a Zoom on this, Ben-Gurion, he asked the people sitting in the room, the temporary government, what should we do? Should we declare the state? Should we not? And they voted, and it was 6-4 in favor, 4 against. Ben-Gurion actually went to Begin. It's hard to say both of the names together. I feel like it's a tongue twister. And he told him, so Begin was a full supporter of the state of Israel. He says, if the government does not declare the state of Israel, the Irgun is going to declare the state of Israel. And Ben-Gurion went to him and he said, could you actually repeat the statement and write it down, because I want people to hear it. Why? Because he knew Begin had a lot of power, and if Begin is in such support of the state of Israel, it's going to help push things over and lead to the eventual declaration. So that was his small role, even though he wasn't part of the government or that meeting in the declaration of the state of Israel. And Begin makes a decision which is remarkable. He decides to join Sahel. Now, why is this so remarkable? Because usually if you have a colonial power, which is the British, and now they're gone, what's going to happen? You have 3 organizations, the Lechi, the Haganah, and the Irgun. Yes, they joined together in 1946 against the British, but now they could separate, and the Irgun could say, hi, we have the most power, let's fight, and let's be the new army. But instead, Begin said, we're the state of Israel, we're one army, we're not the Irgun anymore, we're going to join. And Tzava Haganah Yisrael was formed. Now, Begin didn't like the name Haganah because he said we shouldn't be defense, we should be Tzava Yisrael. But that was the name that was called. Now I'm going to talk about something in Israel's history, which is a very touchy topic and something Israel's not proud of. There's really no conclusion. Like it's just said. There was this ship known as the Altalena, and on June 20th, 1948, it was approaching Israel's coast in Tel Aviv. It had 940 people on it that are ready to come fight for the state. The state is in existence for a month, right? June 20th, the state was declared on May 14th. Many of them are Holocaust survivors. They have tons of ammunition, which could really, really help the state of Israel, especially since they are struggling for their existence. They don't have enough weapons. All the other nations have way more than them. And Begin tells Ben-Gurion, I want to take 20% of the weapons on the ship, and I want to give it to the Irgun fighters in Jerusalem. Why? Because they're fighting a very tough battle. They need help. Let's give it to them. And Ben-Gurion looks at him and says, absolutely not. We are one army. I'm not giving anything special to your fighters. And it's a conflict. And Begin is on the shore, and Ben-Gurion tells him, you have 10 minutes to take off everything from the ship and hand it all over to me. I am the prime minister. I am the head of the defense. I'm giving to everyone. And Begin refuses. And I'm going to say surprise, because I don't know if he expected that this would happen, or maybe everyone's surprised. And they start shooting the ship. Now, they're shooting other Jewish people. They're shooting Jewish people that want to come help them fight. They're shooting Jewish people with weapons. And that's what Ben-Gurion decides to do. Now, like we mentioned earlier, when you're being attacked, the natural thing of self-defense is to fight back. You're being attacked, save your life, especially since you don't agree on what's going on. And I just want to mention, 16 Irgun fighters were killed, 2 IDF soldiers were killed, and Begin declares, he tells them, do not open fire, do not shoot back, do not, because he was not prepared for there to be a civil war among brothers. And he says, not shooting back was the most important decision I ever made in my life. He was prime minister, he did a ton, but he said that was the most. And later on, here's a beautiful quote from him in 1982. He says, after my death, I hope I will be remembered as someone that above all prevented civil war. This is more important in my eyes than my days as the head of the Irgun, from being prime minister, signing peace with Egypt, situation. And he says, I'm not shooting back. One of the jobs that Begin held before he became prime minister was he was the head of something known as the opposition. So the way the government of Israel works, you have the coalition, which are, there's all different parties. The parties join together to form a coalition. And if you're not in the coalition, you're in the opposition, you're opposed to the coalition. And Begin was the head of the opposition. And he said, in order for a government to really be democratic, you need to have an opposition. You need to have people that go against the government. And he even outlined it. He said, here are the roles of the opposition. You need to propose alternate ideas, criticize and oversee the government, and join the government in emergency situations. And part of him being able to survive 29 years in such a tough situation was linked to the fact that he survived 8 months in this tough prison. If he could survive that, he could survive anything. And then eventually, after 29 years in opposition, Begin was elected prime minister and he served 2 terms. Now, they asked him when he was elected, what type of prime minister do you want to be? And I love his answer. He said, Signoni Yehudi Tov. I want to be a good Jew. One of the acts achievements that Begin is most well known. Every time I say the name Begin, I'm like slipping with Ben Gurion. That Begin is most well known for is for creating peace in Egypt with 1979, which is still lasted like years and years and years. Here is a very famous picture. We have the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, US President Jimmy Carter, and Prime Minister Menachem Begin. They're on the lawn of the lighthouse signing a peace treaty. Now, what are the terms of the peace treaty? The terms are a full retreat from Sinai and handing it over to Egypt. If we are reminded of our talk on the 6-Day War, in the 6-Day War in 1965, Israel conquered the whole Sinai Peninsula. And Egypt says, if you want to make peace with us, then you need to give this whole thing back to us. Now, Israel is very badly shaken from the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And most people at the time, they took polls, they said, we want to give back to Sinai, we want peace. Now, we said one of Begin's core values is the whole of Israel, both sides of the Jordan. Yeah, he says, above all, my biggest value is peace. And if I believe this is going to bring peace, I want to do it. And it bring lasting peace. And that was the first Arab country that we made peace with. I say first because now Netanyahu, it's amazing what he did. He made peace with 4 other Arab countries. Like they're all joining in. So we made peace with Egypt. Now, there were some Jews living in the northern Sinai Peninsula, which had to be evicted. And it's a very painful experience. It's not like he says, okay, we'll get back to Sinai easily. And Begin says, I have the deepest pain in my heart from evicting people from Sinai. I will carry this with me till my last day. And something that I'm learning from Begin, or just from the kind of things he went through, is it is a tough job to be prime minister. No matter what you decide is the wrong decision, it is really hard. You need nerves of steel to do that job. Begin and Sadat were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for creating peace. So here are coins that Israel made in honor. And you see here is the famous picture. He was awarded $50,000 as part of the prize, and him and his wife decided we want to give it to a scholarship fund for students that are needy and for children that are needy. So that's what he did with the money. And even if he needed it, he said, there's always people that need it more than me. Begin, so his wife died in 1982, and he was heartbroken from her death. Also, something else I want to add, I'll say one sentence, that in 1982 was the first Lebanon war under Begin's leadership, and it didn't go well, and there were tons of soldiers dying, and it was very hard for Begin to see this, and he, in 1983, I believe, he decided he doesn't want to, I could just look at the years, let me see. No, whatever. He decided he doesn't want to be prime minister anymore. And he spent the last 9 years of his life in his house in Jerusalem, secluded. Only close friends and family would visit. He never spoke about why he left the government. He didn't really speak to anyone after that. No one really knows why. And it could be all the years of tough decisions, but especially the war and the amount of casualties really took a toll on him. And in his will, he had one thing written. He said, I want to be buried on Har HaZitim next to Moshe Barazani and Meir Feinstein. Who are these 2 men? So one was part of the Lehi, one was part of the Irgun, and one was Ashkenaz, one was Sephardic. And the way Begin saw it, he said it's kibbutz galuyot, these two men joining together, fighting. There represents the new Jew who's standing up for himself and to a cause that he believes in for the state of Israel. And Begin wanted to be buried there on Har HaZitim. He, as prime minister, could have been buried in the section which is saved for the heads of state, for prime ministers on Har Herzl, but he wanted to be buried in Har HaZitim, so he's buried there next to his wife. Where can you learn about all this, or did I learn about a lot of this? There is the Menachem Begin Center, which is right near the Tachana Rishona, the first station in Jerusalem. And they have there, it's an hour and 15 minutes about this tour about Begin. They have different rooms all dedicated to his life. Here's a picture of it. Here's a movie, and you sit on benches, you watch movies, you look around. There's an actual human guide that walks with you, but he or she doesn't really speak. It's more the movies that speak, and they tell you about Begin's life. So if you are interested in learning about more of him, that is a great place to visit. Also on a rainy day, it's shady, it's cool, it's nice to go to. Let's summarize. So we started out with a story about Begin meeting this old woman by the Kotel and giving her so much respect as his security agents were pushing her aside. He had respect for all people, believed they were sons of kings. We mentioned the conversations he had growing up where he said, I was always hearing about the future of the Jewish people and the country of Israel. The town speaker from youth and all the way on up until his death. He joined the Beitar youth movement, which believed the whole state of Israel and that a Jew should defend, and Begin added, not just defend, also attack if need be. He met his wife Eliza and loved her tremendously. He spent 8 months in prison, which was a really, really hard time for him and very formative in his life. Then he was released, where he became the head of the Irgun. The Irgun rebelled against the British. Then the Haganah says, hey, we don't like that you're doing this. We can't rebel against the British. And then we have a Sezon period where they're capturing Irgun members. Begin is hiding. We saw the picture of the rabbi. No one knows where he is. Then the declaration of the state of Israel, the painful topic of the Altalena, where Ben Gurion orders fire, even though they're Jewish people. And Begin very admirably says, do not shoot back. I don't want a civil war. And he says, this was the greatest decision I ever made. He was the head of the opposition for 29 years. He believed for democracy to thrive, you need people to go against government in a respectful, kind way, because respect was one of his key beliefs. He was elected the 6th prime minister, and he just wanted to be a Yehudi Tov. He made a peace deal with Egypt in 1979, which still lasts. He died, I got the year, what was it, 1992? 1982, don't even remember. And the Menachem Begin Center, if you would like to learn more about Menachem Begin, please visit the Begin Center in Jerusalem. And I will conclude with, we asked, how can learning about Begin's values help the government and people of Israel? If I had to boil it in one sentence what Begin valued, he valued brotherhood and people not fighting against each other. And it's hard to watch the way the different members of the not formed Knesset fight with each other. And I really respect Begin for things that he stood for. I stand for this, I stand for that, this is what I believe. And I think when parties make what they believe and what they don't believe, as long as Bibi is not prime minister, that's all I stand for. What are your values? That's not a value, Bibi not being prime minister. And it's heartbreaking to see how everyone is fighting with each other. I won't do this, I won't do this. And I think if the government and in my own life, if we keep in mind how valuable peace is and brotherhood, how much it could achieve. And from Begin, what I take on a personal level is I'm not in the government, and I definitely read up on it a lot. But even for me to be critical of it and say, how could they do this and how could they do that? I'm also being critical. So instead, I like to turn it for myself into something more positive, and I pray to God for the government to be peaceful and respectful and to help the leaders of Israel make the right decisions. And it starts with my thought. I try to train my thoughts to be more positive and brotherhood and kind, because I think if I could start with my own thoughts, and if I raise my own kids that way, and if everyone raised their kids and families and spoke it that way, we'd be in a much better place. Thank you so much for joining me. I wish you a wonderful day.
Thank you. You really described him so well. He sounds like a man who had true Havas Yisrael. Beautiful.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
That was great.
Thanks for being here. What would I do without you and Eliza? My core team.
You're so funny.